Hey, thanks again for joining us here on the Gill Athletics Connections podcast. I've got the godfather of track and field. If track and field news is the Bible of track and field, the Bible of our sport, I don't want to overstate it and say I've got God, but I've got the author right here. Help me welcome Mr. Garry Hill from Track and Field News. Gary, how are you, sir?
I'm pretty good considering everything we're all going through.
Well, we're going through a lot and we're going through it together, but what I got to know is I feel a little underdressed here. You've got a really cool shirt going on here, my man. Tell me about this Hawaiian t-shirt.
I don't know, somewhere along 20, 30 years ago, I picked up the habit. And at that time, I was doing a fair amount of infield work, conducting interviews at track meets. And it was always a problem on a crowded infield for people to find me in the stands. So I decided, hey, why not, even if you look like a jerk, stand out and they'll know where you are. And so, like in an Olympic trials in 10 days, I'd trot out 10 different shirts. And my collection grew and grew and grew. And last time I counted, I was up to 63.
63 Hawaiian shirt, all of different colors and
All
patterns.
completely different. Yeah.
Hey, that's really a smart idea about standing out when you're looking for you. A good friend of ours, Brian Fetzer, formerly the head coach at University of Virginia, he also was a Hawaiian shirt guy. And I asked him one day, I was like, hey, I got to get to the bottom of this. What is the deal with the Hawaiian shirts? And almost exactly the same thing you said there. His athletes, would have to find him either in the stands or, across the field, depending on the track meet. And one day he wore, I can't remember what school he started it at. He wore a Hawaiian shirt that had the same school colors, and the kids were able to like laser focus find him, and that became his thing. He was always the Hawaiian shirt guy. I don't know that he has 63 of them. That might be a new record.
Well, I'd have a few more, except a couple of years ago, my wife established a moratorium, and every time I bought a new one, I had to get rid of one. And but that's hard to do. But I like this one of my babies.
When you'd go to look at one to get rid of, would memories of like the track meet or meets that you wore that at come into memory?
Nah, not really, because I had so many, and it was so many years worth.
I didn't know that they had 63 different styles. Like full disclosure, I have a red one that my wife bought me when we went to Hawaii for the first time. And I know there's different colors, but there's not 63 different colors in the world.
Well, you get all kinds of different flowers. You get school logos. That kind of thing. When I do the Olympic trials in Eugene, I always wear a yellow and green one. I have a standard one. In fact, I bought them for the whole booth crew a couple of trials back. And on the final day of the trials, our spotters showed up wearing hula skirts, grass
Oh,
skirts. That never made it into the official video of the meet,
I was,
obviously.
I was about to say, I didn't see that one. Well, I know no one is listening today to get a history lesson of Hawaiian t-shirts, but they are listening because you have had a really interesting role in this great sport of track and field. We have had the luxury, and I mean that, a true luxury of talking to some just fascinating track coaches, some behind the scenes people, guys like Willie Banks that we had here a couple weeks ago, just phenomenal roles in this great sport. I reached out to you because you had such an interesting one as the editor of Track and Field News, which, I mean, if you're in the sport, we know that magazine. That is, it literally is the Bible of our sport. Can you talk to us about what do you do? What does the editor of Track and Field News do?
Well, we're a small publication. We always have been. And the editor has always done just about everything, including back in the days when we were still in print and before digital capacity was upon us, doing layout and paste up with a glue machine and cutting out paper by hand and pasting it on a paste up board before it got sent to a printer. And mainly I edit.
So by
Then
editing,
the editor looks at other people's stories
yeah.
and hopefully brings a little more cohesion, a little more sense. Um, with younger writers, it's important to my bringing historical perspective to things. It's amazing how quickly what to me is recent history is, back in the Stone Age to somebody who's relatively new to the sport.
Does part of your duties include, like, first of all, are you doing any writing or is it all from other writers?
I write a lot of the non-byline stuff, just the sections of the magazine that are news snippets, uh, borrowed from what's happening around the sport. But the actual writing, I haven't done that other than my column in a couple of decades now. To do it properly, it's time consuming. Even if the writing part is easy, the getting a hold of an athlete and the associated people you want to talk to do a story, then tracking them down on the phone, and then transcribing. This has all become largely automated now with voice recognition software, but it was too tough for me to write and edit at the same time, so I bowed out. I never thought I was the world's greatest writer anyway, since I was a bacteriology and public health major in school, which
Yeah.
lead to a lot of creative essays.
Now, I'm a journalism by education, and don't technically do journalism. You're a journalist, and you are a micro. I can't even say it. What was your degree in?
Bacteriology and public health.
Bacteria. What is a bacteria? I can't even say it. Remember, I always remind everybody I was high school and college educated in the state of Alabama, so I get excused when I can't say bacteriology. Did I get it?
That's close.
Okay,
Close
good
enough.
enough. Good enough. Bacterial something. How does someone with the bacterial degree get into editing track and field news?
Well, I was a feeble triple jumper in my high school days, but I was good enough to get a partial scholarship to Washington State.
Oh.
And early in my senior year of high school, I developed a really nasty case of mononucleosis, and I was sidelined for several months.
Wow.
And I never quite made it back to where I'd been. But, I was short and slow, which aren't exactly attributes for great triple jumping. I had some hops, but having a good vertical jump doesn't translate to good three-phase
Right.
jumping the other way. At any rate, so while I was off, and I was still a huge fan, I just started keeping statistics and looking at the history of the sport. Checked out every book that my local library had on track and field, etc. And then when I got to Washington State, I jumped fairly well as a frosh, but developed horrid ankle problems that never went away. And so I just became this huge, huge fan. And the first day I was in my dormitory at Washington State, meet my new roommate that I'd never heard of before. And all of a sudden he pulls out this copy of a magazine called Track and Field News, of which I had never heard.
Oh, wow.
And inside it, there was a listing that we run annually, still do after all these years, called Where They Are Going, which is the compilation of, then I'll be darned if my name wasn't in there. And I said, oh, this is for me.
Wow.
So I instantly signed up for Track and Field News, and I'm not even sure that it was called the Bible of the sport at that time. That came a little later, but before I got there, I don't get the credit for that. And it became my Bible, and that's all I ever did. And I went through mountains and mountains of 3x5 cards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Spent much more time playing with track statistics than I did with schoolwork.
That That is
which is why I'm not
fascinating.
running a sewage plant today.
Yeah.
That was sort of my other option.
That's fascinating that you were in the magazine the first time you saw it and you were in it.
Yeah,
Huh.
very low down, but I was there.
Yeah, okay. Let's take a poll of all the people who are in track and field who have not been in track and field news. Okay, that's still a rarefied air. Did you, so as you poured yourself into this, the statistics side of it and started there, did you ever consider changing majors?
No, it never crossed my mind because I wasn't interested in the journalism side. In
Hmm.
fact, I went out of my way to take classes that didn't require term papers. I made it through 4.5 years and only had to write one term paper. So that was pretty great.
Yeah.
But I did spend much more time in labs than everybody else.
Sure, sure.
There were days when I would have labs from 1 to 5, 5 days a week,
Oh,
you know,
wow.
chemistry and biology.
Mhm.
So what I was interested in was the stats, the keeping numbers, the all-time lists, the
Mhm.
yearly lists, little calculations of, who are the best combined 100, 200
Mm.
sprinters of all time. And so I wanted to be the statistician at Track and Field News. And there were several through the years. And I never thought seriously about it. And when I was about 3 months from finishing up my degree, a copy of Track Newsletter showed up one day, the weekly statistics newsletter that we still publish. And in it was an ad saying, "We need a statistician." And I ran around the house yelling and shrieking and whatever. It was a Saturday morning. I got on the phone. I called the office, got a hold of the janitor, talked him into giving me the phone number of the managing editor at the time, who was Dick Drake. And I called him up and woke him up because he'd been out on Friday night. Anyway, I said, this is for me. Wah, wah, wah. And things played out and they hired me.
Wow.
And so I was the statistician and started doing little bits of writing on the side. And in early 1973, we had, well, let's just say, some turmoil in the personnel department at the magazine. And the managing editor ended up leaving, and I ended up replacing him. So a
Was this
palace intrigue that I won't get into.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So you went to Washington State, which is an amazing school. Visited there, and I had the cheese, the
Cougar Gold.
Washington. That is the Cougar Gold. Are you from Washington originally,
No,
or?
I'm from British Columbia,
Oh, okay,
about 200 miles north of Pullman.
okay,
It's just 6 or 7 miles from the U.S.-Canada border, right where the Columbia River crosses over.
right. And so you come down, you go to school at Washington State. When you go to work officially for Track and Field News, that has it always been in California? I think that's where
Yeah,
originally.
it's always
Okay.
been in Northern California.
So you moved down to Northern California. You keep coming south in
Yeah,
America.
chase the sun.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And you become the managing editor. So what is the difference between a managing editor and your role today?
Well, part of the difference is that I now own the company. I have a share of
Mm,
owning the company.
mhm,
But the difference between being the managing editor and the editor is that the editor has the final say. The managing editor is the guy on the front lines who does a lot of the grunt work, you know, uh, scheduling, arranging
mm,
for writers and photographers, um, doing the actual layout of the magazine, whereas the editor is the ultimate in copy control. It's the desk
mm.
where the bus stops. But through the years, as the company has gotten slightly smaller with fewer personnel, the roles kind of blend.
Mhm.
I mean, I like to say that the editorial department is run as a democracy, but I just happen to have 51% of the vote. I don't always vote it, but
Right, right.
I can vote less than that. So
So what goes in, most people have not published a monthly magazine or even in the newspaper world where it's daily and sometimes weekly, depending on the medium. What's it go into? You know, we're all used to, we all have our favorite track and field news issue in our head, you know, whether it's the cover and maybe a story or something that's in it. What goes into publishing a monthly magazine, the time frame, the layouts? How difficult is this?
It's probably difficult in the ordinary world. It tends to be very difficult in our world in that, well, not to, poor pitiful me,
Yeah, yeah.
but we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, on the first of every month, we're publishing an issue, because the ebb and flow of meets is
Mm.
such that, if you want to have an NC2A coverage issue, and 2 weeks later there's an AAU, started as the AAU, USATF issue, you can try and combine them, but that tends to make a monster magazine that becomes expensive to do, and it also delays the NCAA coverage too long.
Mm.
So you sometimes have to slip in an NC2A magazine that you can only have 10 days in which to prepare before flying off to wherever the USATF site is doing theirs. So, and if that one is like another 3 weeks, you can end up with 2 issues coming out within 6 weeks instead of 2 months. And then there are slow periods in the year, in the fall, where there's basically no news, just like we've had all year this year.
Yeah, right.
There's been one big fall, at least since in the indoor season.
One big fall.
Yeah. And so getting that timing right and trying to keep the content interesting, that's why, if you've noticed, this year's digital issues, the last 3 issues have been 2 months apart,
Mm.
because without hard news to report on, it's pretty hard to come up with, 64 pages or whatever we go for of pure feature material inside 4 weeks. So
Yeah.
we've spread that out, and we will till the foreseeable future. Sometime this fall, we hope to be able to get back into monthly stuff, or we call it monthly, but 12 per year.
Right, right. How long has been, like you mentioned, the where are they going feature, if you will. That's always an extremely popular I don't know what do you call that? I call it a feature. It's not a news story necessarily.
Feature, yeah.
Feature. So, that's an extremely popular feature. When you come out with the predictions for that year's NCAA meet or USATF or World Olympic trials, that's always a big deal. Have those evolved throughout the years, or has that just been since the 70s you've always done that?
Ooh, well, where they are going, or a WATAG as we call it, I can remember reading the 1960 WATAG, so it predates me by a
Oh,
decade.
wow.
And we've always had predictions. We're able to be much more detailed now in the spring with NCAA and USATF, because we can put it online,
Mm.
and it makes sense. It's, you talk about every time you publish something, whether it's a Gill catalog, as you say, the first day you come out, rolls off the press, it's already out of date. And boy, you try and do that with a prediction for a track and field meet,
Right.
and not only is it obsolete the first day it rolls off the press, by the time the post office gets it to you,
Mm.
another week or 2 weeks has gone by, and eventually it became almost pointless to do most of that prediction stuff in the magazine. We just touch on it early in the year to give people a benchmark to play with. And what people don't remember is what the Postal Service used to be like. We used to publish the magazine we'd finish it up on Mondays. It would come off the press on Tuesday, and people all around the country would have it by Friday or Saturday, and that just by regular mail, not even first class mail.
Wow.
So we don't have quite the postal service we used to,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. We had talked before we hit the record button about the catalog that we print and, the frustrations we have because it's already out of date and any errors and things like that. I didn't think about it on your side. I'm dealing with products which are fairly static. You're dealing with on those predictions, people. You don't even know who actually is going to double up in the one and the two, who gets injured, who decides to do just the 400. I never even thought about that aspect of how as soon as you print you're dealing with a thousand athletes and their changes.
Yep. We did a really elaborate Olympic preview in 1972 and really, really proud of it. Countless thousands of man hours went into doing all these details on each event. And I remember the week before we wrapped it up, I worked 140 hours, which is a fairly stiff week. Got on a plane all bleary eyed, got to Paris, and in the train station, I picked up a copy of L'Equipe, which is the French national sports daily, which used to be the best source of international news. And it had the results of several brand new European meets that just absolutely blew up several events that were coming in Munich. But we had no choice. Just that's the way it worked.
How different and I have to say easier is it to get information today than you, because you mentioned doing this in 1972. We obviously didn't have the internet, much harder to call people. Right now a track meet happens in Florida today. We know it on Twitter in 30 seconds. Your time of information has sped up tremendously.
Oh, it's fabulous. You can, for even smaller meets now, with any luck, you find live results and you can follow the meet on your own at your own desired speed.
Mm-hmm.
You can ignore events that you don't care about. See, this is another problem that has struck track and field news, is that we were always very Catholic in our coverage and treated almost all events equally.
Mm.
The hammer throw was equal to the 1500 or the 100. That's not exactly true in the extreme because there are some fave events for everybody. But that means eating up space with events that a lot of people don't care about. It's amazing how many people are quite limited, and I don't use that in a pejorative sense, but are restrictive in what events they care about. If you're a runner, you might not care at all about any field event. And if we're devoting half our space to field events, oh boy.
Mm.
And the same with the women's side of the sport. That was a huge problem we faced when women in the 70s, after Title IX took over and the National Women's Championships merged with the men's for the first time ever was 1976.
Mm-hmm.
People may not realize that, there was close to 100 years of AAU championships that were men only,
Mm-hmm.
and were separate women only. And women don't join the NC2A or aren't allowed to join the NC2A until 1982. And when that happened, a lot of the old guard readers, frankly, just didn't care about the women's side. Didn't dislike it, it just didn't exist.
Wow.
So
That's interesting. We learned a lot with Sue Humphreys. We had her on the podcast a little while ago, and it was fascinating that, of what we think about track and field today. We turn on a track meet and there's men events, there's women events, and both competing at extremely high levels. And she walked us through, like you were just talking there was no NCAA championships. Before that was, I think, the AIW, I think is what she told us. And
AIAW, yeah.
AIA, yeah, I always get that wrong. It was just fascinating. It's like, man, that's not that long ago. Yeah, I was born in 76, so it's barely been as long as I have been alive. It's just hard to even fathom that looking at today's track and field.
Yeah, we've come a long way. We've come a long way as a society.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that I'm proud of for being in track and field, is that the sport as a whole has been very much pushing on social norms and being on the cutting edge of equality.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe the most important question for the editor of Track and Field News: how do you pick who gets on the cover each episode? They have been just iconic covers. It has to be one of the most coveted, I almost want to say, prize that we have in track and field. It's got to be right up there with a medal, the Bowerman. I
Oh,
mean, it
you're being
is.
a little too kind,
No,
but
no,
thank
no,
you, thank
no.
you, thank
It
you.
is special to be on that cover. How do you decide that?
What's really amazing is how much available, usable artwork plays. You,
Okay.
the prime example was uh, Alan Johnson Olympic champion Alan Johnson was one of the world's greatest hurdlers for almost 20 years. Never made the cover.
Is that right?
Yeah. And one of the big reasons that you rarely find hurdlers, or at least high hurdlers, on the cover is because photographers tend to shoot it with a horizontal aspect because they're
Right.
trying to get the hurdle and multiple people in the thing.
Yeah,
And
right.
trying to crop a picture down like that to fit into a portrait mode is
Huh.
almost impossible. And then the other problem with the hurdles is, particularly the high hurdles, be it men or women on the straightaway, the hurdles are a distraction. They create a very multicolored, multi-shaped background, and the athlete doesn't jump out. And that's one of the things you really need, particularly if you're putting headline structures on the
Right.
cover as well. Those have to be readable, and they aren't if they're behind in front of too busy a background.
And I'm going to let it pass as an equipment manufacturer that you said the hurdles were a problem. First of all, Gary, we're just going to let that go. But it has been fascinating to see not only the cover and the pictures chosen and the athletes chosen, how the cover design has changed throughout the years. Internally, it feels like it's been fairly the same, and I don't mean that in a bad way, meaning that the quality of stories has been fairly high. The different, where they go and things like that seems to be fairly consistent throughout the years.
I don't think we do as many really long, quote unquote, investigative pieces as we
Hmm.
once did. Of course, there was a lot more not to like about the sport back in the days when the AAU and the NC2A were warring and athletes were the recipients of all the bad news,
Hmm.
and where just the AAU dealing well under the following the strict strictures of the IOC and the USOC, the AAU had to play cop when it came to things
Hmm.
like money under the table,
Right.
which had been in the sport since there was the sport. I mean, there were professionals in the 1800s.
No, 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 there wasn't.
Well, it is amazing how long that lasted. We had people in the 70s when the breakout started happening, and amateurism became sort of an accepted way of life. That how many fans I would talk to people on the track and field news tours, and they would be quite offended that somebody might actually want to run for money instead of run for their country or their flag, or just run for the amateurism ideal,
Right, yeah, yeah,
which
right.
is it's a wonderful ideal, but it just doesn't work. And it certainly didn't work when most of the European nations had strong government backing, whereas the
Hmm.
US has always stood alone in terms of relying on public support. And that public support, particularly back when the TV money wasn't flowing in to the USOC or the AAU the way it does now, there was very little support that they could give, and people really had to be truly amateur.
Mhm.
You know, and all the Russians and other Soviet bloc, not to pick on them, they basically just all were in the army or the armed forces nominally, and just were able to train year round, and that just wasn't possible for the U.S. athletes.
A few years back, this is 2020, so I guess this is probably around 2010 or so. I was at a show, and I get an email from my shipping manager, and she says she's got two big boxes full of old Gill catalogs that do I want them, or if not, we'll throw them away. And I was like, oh yeah, I'd love to check them out. And so I came back from my trip, and I go back to pick up this box of Gill catalogs, and lo and behold, it wasn't two huge boxes of Gill catalogs. It was two huge, like the boxes you get your paper in, the big reams, slam full of track and field news magazines. And so I took them home. I wanted to go through every one of them. I put them in order, first of all. Very selfishly, I wanted to find, we have two, we have several, but two, I don't want to say former professional track athletes here at Gill. One is our president CEO, David Hodge, was a Nike athlete for the vault, was a several-time All-American at Baylor. I was destined to find him in track and field news. And then now retired, but my former boss, Fred Dixon, was on the 76 and 80. We all know what happened on 80 Olympic team for the decathlon. So I am peeling through. I mean, there were some far as back as the 60s and 70s, all the way up to, just before 2000. And what was amazing was seeing the evolution of our sport in photography and written format. It was really, really interesting. When you said there used to be more long form articles, I kind of noticed that shift as I was looking through all the different decades, if you will, of newspaper-ish to more. This is going to sound terrible, social media-ish. Smaller, easier to read and see chunks, if you will.
Yeah, well, you can credit USA Today for that, actually, or before them, even People magazine. I guess that would be the early 70s, where they sort of changed the way people absorbed print content, short and punchy, big headlines, flashy headlines. We tried to stay away from that as much as possible and stick with our newspaper roots. If you've ever seen the very early first half year of track and field news in 1948, it was a newspaper format. It was printed on newsprint.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, and Burt Nelson, who was one of the two founders, the Nelson brothers, Burt and Cordner Nelson, who founded the magazine, he was a journalism major. And he ran a small newspaper after he got out of the Navy in World War II. And since he had a printing press at the beginning, he was able to run off track and field news there. And after, I don't know how many years, it's a long time ago that he did it, maybe 5 years, he switched completely to the magazine itself. And so through the years, he and his brother ran it basically single-handed for the first 10 years. Did all the writing and all the layout, everything. The very first employee track and field news ever had is also the very first employee that Nike ever had, in the form of Jeff Johnson.
Is that right?
Jeff Johnson mowed Burt Nelson's lawn. And when the subscription list got big enough at Track and Field News, Burt needed help stuffing and mailing the magazine. And so Jeff Johnson, who went on to Nike fame, became the first employee.
Wow, that's interesting. It's amazing. So back in the 60s, when the magazine was getting started, and here we are in 2020, especially in publications, media, journalism, the longevity of this magazine through not only all the financial differences that we've had and that have gone under, we're still talking about track and field, a very niche sport. Um, Competitors who have or have not come into the same space. It is quite amazing to see consistently still serving the sport of track and field.
Well, we've always made it a policy as much as possible to hire track nuts who know how to write. We've always found it easier to train a track, not to put down journalism, but easier to train a real track fan to do acceptable journalism than it is to take a really great writer and have them become a track fan. That conversion is really difficult. So it doesn't mean we don't welcome fabulous writers. Whenever we get a chance, we avail ourselves of them. That's for certain.
What has been in your lifetime here now at Track and Field News, has there ever been, so track is in its own, like I said, it's niche. Has there ever been something that transcended track, whether it was a cover, whether it was a story, something from outside of track that came into track, anything like that through the years?
Oh boy. Well, we certainly caused a bit of a stir a couple of years before I came on board in the fall of '67 with a long story with Lee Evans and Tommy Smith regards a potential '68 Olympic boycott.
Mm.
And so this presaged Tommy and John on the stand at Mexico City by a full year. And that created quite a stir because, well, people just weren't used to that.
Mm-hmm.
And to athletes speaking their mind. And so it was convenient in that both Tommy and Lee lived just down the road from Track and Field News headquarters. And they were good friends of the magazine. So it was, they made themselves quite available for some long chat. I think that's probably the most stunning thing that was ever on our front page. Well, that was in the magazine format. It's not a big blow up headline. It was Tommy and Lee discuss '67 boycott in a little corner of the front page.
Was it a big deal? I know what they were talking about was a big deal. Was it a big deal for the magazine because you gave voice to it, like because you allowed their story to be told and what they were thinking, or was it just based on what their action that they were undertaking?
Well, it was before I was at the magazine, so I'm an outsider's take. I got the feeling that it set up quite a reaction in the broader sports world. This was the first time, in my knowledge, that anybody had heard of Dr. Harry Edwards. He was a prominent voice in all this. And it obviously took off in the next year. The amount of hate mail that we got was absolutely stunning. Much of it couldn't be printed because of the racial nature of it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh. Do you still get hate mail?
Do you still get hate mail?
The idea that someone would write down their thoughts to put into the post office to send to you, just like would boggle my mind that if someone actually did that versus emailing you or whatnot.
Yeah, we get maybe a dozen letters a year.
Yeah, okay.
If that many now, it keeps falling off. It's a lost art.
They're all nice mail of letters, right? Like,
basically, they are.
Yeah. If someone's going to take the time to write it down, I feel like it would be in a positive nature. If it was just a, hey, I can't believe you did this, it would just be an email or a tweet.
Yeah. In the history of getting letters, we used to get lots, obviously. They were nearly always all positive. Although if they were negative, it would tend to be we'd print a letter from somebody who took a very negative stance. For example, we've been running a retrospective series on our web page for the last 3 months of the Prefontaine Chronicles, covering every bit of space we ever gave him in his 7-year career. And if somebody would write in and criticize Pre for being a prima donna or whatever, then Pre's people would rise up and send all kinds of "how dare you" letters. Pre is God kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah,
So,
there's certain people you just don't talk bad about, right?
yeah, yeah. So that's been proving to be perhaps our most popular web offering that we've ever served up in our 20 odd years of having an online 20 years, my goodness, 25 years
Is
at least.
the throwback, if you will?
Well, Pre is such an iconic
You think it's
figure,
free? Yeah.
and having the 2 movies made about him
Mhm.
uh, certainly has kept the legend alive, and even young runners know that there was a Pre.
Mhm.
And so we thought it would be a good idea to serve it up at a low energy time in the sport, and
Mhm.
getting a lot of positive feedback.
Yeah, I don't know if it's because of coronavirus or the lack of track and field that we have right now in relation, we're supposed to be at the Olympics and things like that right now, or if it's just human nature. But those type of, and you're talking about the pre throwback specifically, but those type of old school throwbacks, the historical, which is amazing because I don't think people like history all that. I don't think, I don't hear a lot of people saying the history class was their favorite class in school. But those type of, like, when we post, we'll post a picture from our factory, back in the 60s and 50s and whatever, and those posts always garner the majority of engagement. um, I know when I was looking through those old magazines that we had, one of the things that really struck to me is you guys had interviewed Fred Dixon back then, 1977. I think he was number 1 in the world in 77. And it was fascinating to read in 2007 his answers, because it was the same person. Like, you could have interviewed him today and it would have been the same as it was back then. So it's just something with that old school throwback. I think there's a yearning that we want to know history. We just don't want to sit down maybe and study it in a history book.
Have to be force fed.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, at least,
driplets. We need droplets of it.
yeah, it's tough to get somebody into it, but once you get going, I think you discover that it's very interesting, and very much for the same reason you said. You get the echoes, if you know of the person today in any way, how little people change at their core.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
their outlook on life, of course,
Bingo.
modifies as you go on, as you add a mate and children and
Mm-hmm.
more children and grandchildren, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. You'd look at life just a little bit differently.
And I would think, as a, call it, an athlete today, is 18 to 30 years old, to see your coach or someone that you know as a coach, and then to find out that he or she was an awesome athlete, or coached high level back then. Like, we only think of in terms, broad picture here I'm painting, of course, but we think of in terms of today and the present. To know some more about the past of people that we think we know, that's been one of the, for me personally, but the feedback I've heard from listeners of the Gill podcast is to hear of people that they know, and then to hear their journey and to where they got to where they are has been like just so inspirational. That, oh man, this guy and gal started down here and now they're the head coach at Florida, or they're the preeminent throws coach at Ashland, and they started just like I did, a regular old athlete or a regular old coach, if you will. That's been the feedback that we've received, just to see that history of coaches and athletes alike.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, what else do you do besides taking people's writing and making it better? Maybe making a couple of writers cry because they thought they wrote like the most amazing Shakespeare-ish type prose, and you just chop it up to make sure it fits. What else do you do in the sport of track and field?
Well, speaking of chopping it up so it fits, the good news is that's the awesome part about having an online presence. You don't need an axe anymore. You just write, and unless they're getting really verbose, and we've been down this road 3 times already, there's no need to cut anybody off. and say that, you got a hard cap of
Mm.
1,500 words or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So what else do I do?
Yeah.
Well, what I used to do a fair amount of, or did a lot of at one time, was stadium announcing.
Hmm.
People always say, well, how come we never see you on TV? And my stock answer is, I got a face made for radio.
Hey, good reminder. This does go up on YouTube, Gary. So this
I
face,
know.
they're going to see
I
you
should have
now.
combed both my hairs.
The secret's out.
Yeah. Um,
What kind of meets have you done?
well, at the high end, I've done a lot of work for the International Federation out of Monaco. I've announced in 20 different countries,
Wow.
including the last five of the last 6 Olympics. And I've lost track of how many world championships I've done indoors and out.
Is this in stadium announcing, or are you doing it
Yeah,
for a radio? Okay, so
just in stadium stuff.
Here's going to be maybe just a don't laugh at me too hard when I ask this question. You said you've announced in 20 countries. Do you speak other languages, or is it all in English?
I have, when pressed, done some French
I
announcing,
wondered about French, right? Okay.
but I just learned enough of the other languages to be able to order a steak and beer in a restaurant.
Oh, the important words. Okay, got
The
it.
important words. And I'm a master at ordering sushi, so Tokyo would be perfect for me when I ever get there again.
That's right. That's right. So what's it like? That's obviously, being an announcer is different than being the editor of a print magazine. What are the highlights that announcing brings for you?
I guess I get as excited as the audience. I mean, I've always thought that among the prime rules of being an announcer is to raise the involvement level of the crowd,
Mhm.
uh, both by trying to make it inciting, but also by being educating without being pedantic, and just try to keep them aware of what's going on everywhere on the field at all times. Although when I first started, most meets were single announcer. The concept of having 2 people share just didn't exist, which meant that field events tended to get ignored. In fact, I'm told that in the 50s and 60s, when they would have huge meets in the LA Coliseum with 50 or 60,000 people, the announcer wouldn't even mention the field events.
Just running.
They'd tell you what's going on the running events, and if you cared about the field event, you brought your own scorecard and watched the field board indicator.
Huh.
And if you missed a jump because you were watching the end of a race, then it could be an oops unless you found somebody else sitting next to you.
You need a backup and a backup to the
Yeah,
backup.
exactly. So have had a lot of partners now through the years. Most recently, Paul Swangard and I, who does a lot of work for NBC now,
Mhm.
and he and I did Rio together. And it's really handy when you do the Olympics with somebody that you know.
Mm.
Announcing an Olympics or a World Championships is quite the job, because not only does virtually every second of your time have to be scripted with the producer yelling in your ear
Oh, right.
because of TV considerations. TV carries the whip hand completely.
Mhm.
You've also got multiple languages to deal with.
Mm.
So, for example, at the 2005 World Championships in Helsinki, Finland, they have 2 official languages, Swedish and Finnish. And at that time, French was a mandated part of the protocol.
Hmm.
So every announcement had to be made by 4 different announcers in 4 different languages.
That sounds like a disaster.
So well, that's why you rehearse together
Oh, sure.
a little bit, and you learn body language and winking and waving at each other. If we were on screen, we would look like idiots doing this all the time. So they've basically cut back French almost to nothing now, other than the ceremonial, and even find that in non-English speaking nations, the English is sliding towards becoming the prime voice. The rationale being that when you're at an Olympics or World Championships, excuse me, you have a lot of people from other countries who are around, and if they speak a second language, it's going to be English. The host country's second language is almost certain to be English, and we get lucky to be dominant that way. I lost my train of thought there. English language dominant. It'll come back to me.
Well, you were talking about that language. A friend of ours, Harry Mara, was on the podcast and talking about his time with Ash and Bree, and never dawned on me that aspect as the coach and athlete communication as you're working within the system of the Olympics or the world champs, and other people are speaking different languages. And I mean, it boggles me for someone who's never been there. I just can't imagine how would you operate.
Okay, that reminds me of my train of thought.
There, I knew it would help.
It's important as an announcer to remember that not only are you talking to the audience, you're talking to all the athletes on the field. They have no other form of communication, obviously, than what they're hearing out of the voice box in the sky. And so it's important that you remember to keep everybody informed at all times.
You mentioned having a partner like Paul, this tandem aspect. Are you guys, is it you're going back and forth and communicating to the audience, or is a tandem person more of like a spotter to help you know where to go next?
No, we split the events down the middle and
okay.
Bounce back and forth, and as much as possible, if somebody is working on track events, then the other guy does the field event. It makes it crazy if you just followed every step of oh my God, that was exciting, 1,500 meters. And during that 4 minutes or 5 minutes with the build up and rundown, you've missed, a half dozen jumps in the long jump, perhaps. And when I say miss, not only can you not say anything about it, you certainly just haven't been able to pay attention. So the other guy is always waiting. As soon as there's that break at the end of a race, when the crowd amps its voices down, then bam, in comes the other guy. You want to be talking as much as possible.
So it's more of a two-headed monster.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense.
A two-headed monster in two languages, so all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Holy cow. I never realized how much would go into it. Mike J was recently on a podcast, the Meeting of the Unknown Minds, hosted by good friend Matt Eshe, and he was talking about the building up to each meet that he does, the Drake relays and what have you, how much research goes into it. He feels like his job is to make sure that I know, like, to honor all the athletes, I got to know something about them, if you will.
Yeah, Mike and I have worked several nationals together. He's terrific.
Okay. Yeah.
He's always consummately well prepared. He's got a great voice, and he projects it nicely, and the crowd responds.
So you mentioned 5 of the last 6 Olympics, untold amount of world championships. I'm assuming NCAA champs and meets at Oregon pre and what have you. Is there a favorite? Well, I'm going to ask you 2 ways. First of all, is there a favorite place that you like to announce? And it could be for any reason. It could be the best steak and beer combo you've ever had. It could be the fans. It could be the press boxes filled with stacks of Hawaiian t-shirts. Is there a favorite place?
Well, gee, if you want to go the steak and beer or steak and wine route, that would be St. Elmo's in Indianapolis.
Oh yeah,
But
nice.
Indianapolis doesn't host big meats
I
anymore, so we've
know.
lost that one.
What a travesty, by the way.
Yeah.
Travesty.
Favorite place and least favorite place are the same
Hmm.
place, and that's Eugene.
Really?
The crowds. I assume you must have been to many meets at Hayward Field.
I'm not allowed to work for Gill Athletics if I haven't been to Eugene
Yeah.
for meets. Yes.
Okay. Well, you know what it's like.
Yes.
The vibe in the stands. It's not just the vibe in the stands. You can walk into the grocery store, to take some food back to your motel room, and they ask you, "Are you here for the meet?" kind of thing.
Yep.
It's just in.
Only
But
place in the world. Well, only place in my world.
and then the knowledge of the fans is
Mhm.
fabulous. But the physical layout, it's almost impossible to see anything. So I can trash them now that it's gone.
I was gonna say, has it, as far as you know, has it changed with the new layout? I don't know if you've.
I have not been. I can at least it'll be a modern stadium.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this one had pillars in the way, TV stations, you know, cameras, big cameras on tripods, and you'd stand up and try and look like this, and the runners on the straightaway would come out and they'd disappear for a couple of seconds at 20 meters. They'd disappear for a couple of seconds again at 40 meters.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult.
Well, I know they've let out a few pictures and videos here and there. I've seen some of the behind the scenes. We're doing all the equipment there. And I mean, I've been to almost every stadium in this country, not internationally. And I still, when I see some of the videos, it looks like it's a rendering. It doesn't look real with what they have done and how they've done it. They've just done an amazing job. And I can only imagine, you know, what they're really good at is not just what the 400-meter track is going to look like. They also think of the stands and what's it going to look like for the audience and things like that. But their attention to detail is really impeccable. I have to imagine where press and announcers sit is going to be just everything you could ever want and wish for to do your job.
I would certainly hope so.
Well, I hate to say it's too late if they didn't, but I know they did.
Is.
I know they
did. In theory,
did.
I guess I'll find out next May at the Pac-12.
That's right, exactly. I'll be there. I'll see you there, buddy. So the second question I was going to ask with that is, so out of all these Olympics, world champs, meets at Oregon, NCAA meets all around the country, is there a favorite call? Was there a race that you did that just goes down as number one, gives you chills to remember?
You know, I've been asked this before, and I've never come up with a really definitive answer, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let me ask it a different way then. So not to put you on the spot and make you find the apex, the number one, what are some memorable calls that you've had that you were blessed to be a part of?
Oh, boy. The first one that really stands out is the 1996 Olympic trials in Atlanta. And I hope I'm remembering my facts right here. In the semifinals of the 200, Michael Johnson breaks the world record in the 200, except he doesn't because it's wind aided. And in those days, we didn't have the same instantaneous pop-up of the wind reading, as I recall. And the stadium is going absolutely berserk. And then I have to say, but it's illegally wind aided. You know, I got booed like it was my fault.
What did you do that for, Gary?
What I remember more than famous race calls is getting good satisfaction out of introductions that go over well.
Oh, okay. Such as?
In London in 2012, in the 200, I introduced Bolt, and I said, and in lane 4 or 5, whatever he was in, I said, some call him the fastest man on the planet. He's the fastest man on all the planets. Crowd went berserk, and NBC's coverage actually went quiet, so that came through on the
The
a
fans
TV
and
feed.
oh
So
wow. So with a statement like that, is that on the fly or did you already have that spooled up for when you were going to announce Bolt for the 200?
it might have been on the fly. I try not to script things because scripted
Right.
things just all too often come across as scripted, no matter how off the cuff you might think you are.
Right, right.
So
That's
you
what I was
know,
wondering.
it's like in the London women's pole vault, Yurisley Silva of Cuba is in this close match with
Mhm.
Jen Shur for the gold medal, and Silva came through with a big come through clearance at some height, and I yelled, "Hi-yo, Silva!" That was totally off the top of my
Nice.
head. The producer yelled at me. He said, "What are you doing?" I just, wave him off. You put up with it, dude.
That's what I would think that based on the reaction from the Usain Bolt and I know the Silva one, that the most authentic ones, the ones that are off the cuff, if you will, not scripted, have to be the ones that get the best feel. You're right. They can feel when it's, and now you saying, but you're reading off of something because you prepared it versus the emotion of what you're doing. It drives the language that you speak, if you will.
Yeah. Well, Bolt, like Carl Lewis before him, and Jackie Joyner Kersey, I kind of got out of the habit of prepping anything on their list of credentials. The list is so long,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to sort it out, and so boring. I would try and find a way to dance around. I don't need to tell you who this is, and just keep
Mm-hmm.
it that simple. And the all the planets thing just was the iteration of that kind of mind thought.
There's lots of talk about track and field and what can we do to improve it for the quote unquote average fan or average person. There's different topics of shortening track meets, whether you focus on world records or first place, things like that. One of the not often talked about aspects that I think is extremely important is a good announcer. I think helping the fans, the people that are in the stands, know what just happened and how that affects the totality of the meet, whether it was a world record or another gold medal for a country for their count, etc. I think that's extremely important, and there's not enough announcers out there, and certainly not enough great announcers.
It's a hard job, you know. I'm not trying to sound full of myself.
Sure.
It's easy, quote unquote, easy for me to be what I assume most people think is a decent announcer because it's what I do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got the facts and the relative sense of how important something is. Whereas you can you could have James Earl Jones or Morgan Freeman do a track meet, and while they would be wonderful to listen to, having the best voices on the planet,
Ever.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I have my doubts about their ability to make a track meet enjoyable,
Mm.
just as I can't do Shakespeare.
That's right. Yeah, we won't put you on the spot and
Oh, good.
quote any Hamlet. Do with such a background of thinking about track as a publication and as an announcer, do you ever get the occasion to go to a track meet as a fan, or is it always in some aspect of work, of your profession?
Um, it's been quite a few years since I went as a fan, just simply because as I got older and enjoyed traveling less and had more to do at the office as our staff shrank, and with the amount of work that's required to actually do a high-end announcing job these days, I pretty much got away from it.
Mhm.
But I started announcing, my first meet ever was the 1977 San Francisco Indoor Games, where I did the field event announcing. And so for the rest of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, I only announced at 10% of the meets I went to. So I went to lots of meets as a fan.
Mhm.
And I always made a point, if it was feasible, not to sit in the press box, but to go sit in the stands uh, with the ordinary folk and try and gauge, you know, just to get a feeling for how they reacted to the sport
Hmm.
and what they liked and what they didn't like. And that did dual duty. It helped me as an announcer, but it also helped, I hope, in trying to make a magazine product that would appeal to as many people as possible.
I can appreciate that. That is working on your craft. That's not just going up to the booth to announce and you telling other people what you'll like. It's me trying to study what you might like. That's really interesting. That perfection of craft, if you will.
Yeah, but every time I learned the name of a new athlete, I forgot the name of a bacterium.
Yeah, yeah. There was a lot of room to fill and get rid of that stuff. Well, Gary, as we start to wrap up today, we've talked about just your journey and through the different aspects of the magazine, how the magazine has continued to evolve as well. What does maybe it starts with the present, but what does the present and future look like for the greatest magazine for the greatest sport?
Boy, I wish I knew. Uh,
Look into your crystal ball here.
I mean, I would be able to give you a more cogent answer if we didn't have our friend C19
Mm,
floating about, which is not to cop out. That's obviously just changing absolutely everything about our lives in every day, in
absolutely.
every way. Um, it's going to be tough to keep the magazine going if the tour side of the project goes away.
Mm,
That's a decent profit center. But if people can't or won't travel to track meets anymore, then
all right.
we're faced with a contraction. And we need to convince people that we're turning out a significant enough online product, that most of which is hidden behind a paywall, that is worth their hard-earned money to pay us, that we're actually giving them something that they can't get for free elsewhere. Or if they can get it for free elsewhere, they'll get a watered down version. We still hope that we bring nice informed points of view to the whole sport, which we all love. Well, we wouldn't still be in it after all these years.
Yeah, as I think about, my childhood growing up and enjoying track and even through my career coaching, I mean, track and field news was always like that is what you looked forward to every episode. Who was going to be on the cover? What were the rankings going to look like? I mean, it was a part of track and field and bringing really my heroes, to read about Carl Lewis and what he was doing and behind the scenes things I would never have seen. That was a big part of my passion for track and field. And I think that's what you guys and your writers and photographers, it takes a whole team of people to put this together to tell the stories. I think that's what you guys bring. And I think it's maybe needed now more than ever. We've gone, everything ebbs and flows. And I think there's whichever one of those ebb and flow is high, I think that's where we should be on content, and that's what you guys are providing immensely.
Well, we're trying. I certainly appreciate all the wonderfully kind things you said about us.
Well, I don't say anything in a vacuum. I'm speaking for literally hundreds of thousands of athletes, coaches, parents. I mean, it's so many roles that you guys have served over the years here, and so it was important for me to reach out to the figurehead for me anyway. I know there's, like I said, there's a whole team of people that do an amazing job, but the letter from the editor is one of the first things I would always read. You always had such interesting points of the sport of track and field that it was important for me to reach out to just learn more about the magazine. I don't want to say bring awareness to the magazine, because if you have not ever heard of track and field news, then you're not in track and field. Let's just start there. But it does bring immense value. I always say, a lot of people in business, one of the first things they do each morning is they get their Wall Street Journal, right? Or their, maybe USA Today. Every day of work that I have had for 14 years here now at Gill Athletics, the first thing that pulls up on my computer screen when I log in for the day is track and field news. I always told my bosses that is my Wall Street Journal. I go and look at the headlines that you guys rebroadcast in there, hyperlink in your original content that you have there. That is always my first place. That is my source for the sport of track and field. And so for me, and I know I speak for tons and tons of people, but for me personally, Garry, for you and your entire team and people that have been on the team in the past, I can't say thanks enough, man. It is what drives me and educates me in this sport.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. You've had a lot of great guests, and I know you'll have a lot more.
Well, none go better or higher than you in the journalism part of this sport, my friend.
Okay.
Garry, thanks again for joining us today, man. I'm just so appreciative that you would spend time with us, help us to learn more again about this magazine that has just touched so many people's lives and made heroes out of just awesome the sport of track and field athletes. Thank you so much, Garry. Really appreciate your time today.
Goodbye.